I think you're right. And it was interesting. I am doing this really because I need to do this for my own mental health, if you want so, because I would be missing it. But at the same time, I've also become to realize that it's actually really helpful for me to spend these 4 weeks throughout the year on the unit, directly on the unit, and see firsthand some of the problems that I sometimes just hear in discussions. And and that's something that I underestimated before I started this, how helpful it is to see those things and how helpful it is to actually work directly with some of our frontline healthcare workers.
Welcome to On Air with Chai, a podcast that inspires, brings hope, shows strength, and resilience. On today's episode, we had the great honor of speaking with Dr. Ronald Cohn, the CEO of SickKids Hospital. Take a listen as we discuss the current state of healthcare, the future of the healthcare, future of gene therapy, and much more. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of On Air with Chai. I'm one of your hosts, Bryan Strasberg, and as always, co-hosting with me today is Mordechai Rothman, the Executive Director of Chai Lifeline Canada. Morty, I know when I do the intros, I always state that we have an incredible guest with an amazing story today, though I think we truly do have a very special guest. Listeners, I know your ears will be glued to this conversation. That is about to take place. Today's incredible guest is a doctor. He was appointed Chief of Division of Clinical and Metabolic Genetics, Co-Director of the Center for Genetic Medicine, Senior Scientist at SickKids Research Institute. He became the inaugural Women's Auxiliary Chair in Clinical and Metabolic Genetics in April of 2013, and joined the Department of Molecular Genetics at University of Toronto. In 2016, he was appointed to the position of Chief of Pediatrics at SickKids and Chair Pediatrics at the University of Toronto. To top it off, since May 1st, 2019, he's been holding the title of President and CEO of one of the greatest children's hospitals in the world. In fact, according to the Nature Index 2021 annual tables, SickKids ranked number 23rd of healthcare institutions globally, up from 28th in 2020. That puts SickKids into the top 3 pediatric healthcare centers in the world, alongside Boston Children's Hospital, St. Jude's Research Hospital. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me the honor to introduce Dr. Ronald Cohn, President and CEO of SickKids Hospital. Welcome, Dr. Cohn.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute honor, absolute privilege to have you here today. We love the work that you guys do. We try to work with you guys when we can, with our clients as well. You guys have been very gracious, very opening, very welcome to us throughout the years, and we are gratefully appreciative of it.
Well, and we appreciate our partnership with you and all the help you're providing for our patients and families a lot.
You know, there's so many questions to kind of start with. The person in your position, I guess easiest way to start this kind of conversation is, who's Dr. Cohn outside of the hospital, beyond the white coat, beyond the business card, beyond the CEO and president?
First and foremost, I'm a husband and a father. And outside of this, I'm a hobby cook, a hobby chef.
What's your favorite thing to cook?
I don't have a favorite thing to cook, to tell you the truth. I like to try different things. So I can't tell you, I don't think I have a signature dish really. It depends on also who I cook for. If it's for my son or my children, it's often something meat related. If it's for my wife, it's often fish related. So all kinds of different things.
That's so interesting. Well, Dr. Cohn, beyond obviously being a husband and a father, you find yourself in a very important role within the pediatric healthcare world, and I'm curious, how do you get here? How do you feel that you got here? And I'm not talking about what's written up on the SickKids website. I'm talking about the person, Dr. Cohn. How did you get here? Where did obviously not born in Canada, came to Canada, and what's your story?
it's probably a long story, but I'll try to keep it concise. So I always wanted to be a doctor. I think from the age of 7 or 8. My grandfather was a physician too. He was a family practitioner who practiced in a setting that doesn't really exist today anymore, more like a living room kind of setting than a doctor's office. And I used to go with him during my vacation time and just sit next to him and watched him, and I always loved it. So I early on decided I want to go to medical school. It was difficult for me to get into medical school because most people probably don't know, and less people even believe me, that I was a really bad high school student. And barely made it through high school. And
So
then
there's
the
hope for
system,
everybody.
yeah, no, I tell the story to encourage people who are not doing well in high school, and then even further on, the system in Germany where I went to medical school, where I was born, was as such that people who were not good enough with their high school grades had an opportunity to take a test like the MCAT. It was not required like it is here. And if you did well enough in the MCAT, then you had an opportunity for an interview. And I remember that interview, I was, I think, 18 or 19, sitting in front of like 12 German professors in their white coat, and they were asking me all sorts of questions, one of them being, how do you feel about science? And back then I told him, oh no, I have no interest in science. I just want to be a doctor. I mean, several years later, I would have loved to go back to that panel and tell them. So I didn't make it into medical school because of that answer initially, but eventually I made it, and then took that as a huge opportunity and took it then also much more serious than my high school time, and became a very hardworking student. And then when I started, I worked in order to earn money. I worked in an emergency room, like as a helper, like a runner, if you want. So moving things, moving patients, blood samples, and so on. And there was a trauma surgeon who I thought was the coolest person on earth, and I thought I want to be just like him. So for a good 2 years, the first 2 years of my medical school, I was sure I'm going to be a surgeon, like a trauma surgeon. And then one of our closest friends, he was actually also the rabbi who married my wife and I 30 years ago, had a child who was born who pretty much stopped developing at the age of 3 months. And initially, he was given a diagnosis of what's called mitochondrial myopathy, which back then there was no internet. That's how old I am already. And I remember my friend calling me saying, "What is this?" And I went to my dictionary, like a book dictionary, to look it up, and it said disease of the mitochondrion, which I thought, oh, I could have figured that out. But that was the moment where I decided I'm going to write my medical thesis about these disorders, and that was the moment where I knew I wanted to be a pediatrician and a neurogeneticist. I mean, back then the term neurogenetics didn't really exist, but it was a very personal experience that made me shift away from wanting to be a surgeon. So I then maybe want to just close the circle on my friend's child before I continue to tell you who I am. Because it was about 3 years ago, after 27 years, that we finally made a genetic diagnosis. So he lives in a home in Switzerland. And that was an unbelievably emotional moment. I've learned through my patients that with the development of genetic technologies and the ability to make more and more diagnoses, what a humbling experience this is often to tell parents, this is the reason why a child has certain medical problems. And I have then experienced this very, very close to my heart. So it was a very emotional moment when I spoke to the mom about this. So I started my medical pediatric residency in Germany, and then decided I want to do some real research. And went to the United States, to Iowa City, because one of the leading researchers in muscular dystrophies happened to be in Iowa City. And then when there was a decision to be made, should I go back to Germany with my family? I had 2 children at that point already, or stay in the United States. We made a personal decision to stay in the United States, mainly because growing up Jewish in Germany was not easy. It's a lot of anti-Semitism that I personally experienced, my wife experienced, and we just didn't want our kids to be exposed to this and grow up like this. So I went to Iowa City, and then from there started all over again my pediatric and genetic residency at Johns Hopkins. And after like 12 years or so, SickKids knocked at the door and asked me to be the chief of medical genetics here. And I came here a couple of times, and I fell in love with the hospital and also the city a little bit, but initially mainly the hospital. There's a special aura in this hospital of people who are really dedicated to work for the children, for their families, and that extends from everyone. This is not just the frontline clinical worker, but everybody who's working here, and that really caught me in a way that we then moved here 10 years ago. And then, as you said, throughout the time, I was lucky and privileged enough to become the chief of pediatrics and the chair of pediatrics at the university. And to tell you the truth, at that point, I kind of thought I've reached the pinnacle of my career, and I was the happiest person ever. I loved this job. I loved the opportunities I had to work with students, with residents, with my faculty colleagues. And then when our previous CEO went back to the United States, one of the board members asked me to apply to this position, which I initially told him, no, I'm not going to do that. And he asked me, why would you not want to do this? And I told him, I'm afraid that I could never give up my identity as a physician and a scientist. So still today, when people call me an administrator, I don't like it. I mean, of course, I do a lot of administrative things, but I don't like the term. And I spent a long time, like several weeks, thinking about it back and forth, taking lots and lots of walks with my wife, who I think put it the best. At the beginning of our conversations, she said, you know, when you were appointed chief of pediatrics and chair of pediatrics, it was like putting on a suit that fit you and you just ran with it. And with this, you have to think about whether you can tailor the suit to you, that you can run with this too. And I don't know, several weeks into this, we took a walk and I shared some ideas and thoughts about what one could do in this position. And then she looked at me and said, I think you're already choosing the color of the suit. And that was the moment really when I thought, okay, I probably would want to apply to this position. And I did, and I was lucky enough to get it. It's a huge privilege to be in this position. But I have to tell you, I was initially almost a bit surprised how much I enjoy being in this position. And I haven't lost my identity. I continue to carry my laboratory with the help of one of my colleague scientists who is helping me with a lot of the day-to-day work. And I continue to be on call for inpatients and have an outpatient clinic once a month. So I keep doing this, so I'm not losing my identity. Well, that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's in a nutshell.
Well, thank you for that. And would you say that same, I guess, motive that everybody that you kind of described that goes on at SickKids, is that something that still compels you today, even in your role of
Everything.
whatever you can do to help the children? Because here at High Lifeline, we have a very similar type of, we live by certain values, and one of the values is dedication. And the way we show dedication is by exceeding expectations. And whether that's between coworkers, whether that's between High Lifeline case managers and families, whoever it is, and dedication is integral. And I love hearing that Sick Kids has this very similar ethos.
Every single day I see it. Every single day. And I know it sounds almost a little bit dramatic when I say this, but it's really true. And, we have gone through now almost 2.5 years of like unprecedented challenges, and they continue. I know that we don't feel the pressure of the pandemic as much anymore as we used to. But the pressures we see in the hospital in terms of staffing shortages and like people just being overworked, I see we continue to experience, and yet no matter how stressful things are, everybody continues to work as hard as possible and it is driven by the dedication of what it is we are doing. And that is something which makes me proud almost every single day.
So with everything going on with the healthcare system today, with a lot of shortages, burnout, overworking of the nurses and doctors, how are you keeping your staff's energy going? How are you keeping them smiling and still enjoying what they're doing and keeping them from falling to that hole of the burnout?
Yeah, because it all starts from the top, right? It's a top-down type of thing. I find at least often.
I think some of this is coming from the top. I agree with you. But I will also admit to you that right now it's probably more challenging than it has ever been to ensure that people continue to smile and be happy. And I'm not sure that there is a golden bullet, but what I can tell you is that I myself and my entire executive team, what we are trying to do is to go as much out of our way as possible to let people know how much we appreciate of what they do, and recognize how difficult it is right now to do what they do, much more difficult than it was probably 2 or 3 years ago. And we are trying to listen a lot to what people are saying and trying to identify issues that are under our own control that we can change. There are a number of things that are not as much under our own control. But I think it's a process, and I think it will be a process that will require even more and more energy over the next few months, if not years, to ensure that everybody keeps engaged and is happy to continue to work here.
So I want to talk a little bit more about that, and you just shared your very personal story, and thank you for that. And I'm curious, would you say that or how would you say, because I'm sure it did, how would you say that your time working as kind of a runner in the emergency room in a hospital in Germany affects you today as you're running, today sitting where you sit in SickKids? Would you say that time, did it affect it? How did it affect it? I mean, I would assume it did, but I'm just curious. I know for myself, it was, I started as kind of a low-level administrator in a role in New York, at the OU, it was called at the time, actually. And I used to get somebody coffee, and he bought me lunch once or twice a week, and I had like literally no money, and that really shaped my outlook on how to treat people and understand how somebody just doing something a little nice for someone else at a time when they need it really makes a big difference. So I'm curious how that time in the emergency room would have affected yourself.
Oh, it created the entire basis of who I am as a person and as a physician, because you it's not just about doing some of the runner work that you're talking about, but it provides you also the basis of learning how to interact with colleagues and patients and families in a completely different way. You know, when you come in as an educated healthcare professional, whether that's respiratory therapist, a nurse, or a physician, you almost immediately have a power differential. And that power differential is significantly less when you're just one of the helpers there. So it provides you a very different access and interaction to patients who seek out help in an emergency room back then, as an example. And then you build from there. Everything, uh, every single experience professionally that I've had after that, as a resident, as a physician, as a leader, is built on that. So, and I think when you look at my current role, when we are talking about clinical challenges, you know, even if they happen to be in areas that I'm obviously not an expert in, I do understand the fundamentals of patient care because I have gone through every single step of what that looks like.
Yeah, it's not every day I think that you meet a physician that has worked as a runner in an emergency room, and so it sounds like you're very aware of a power differential, and you almost try to remove that a little bit with it, between the patient and the doctor in order to get the real relationship or the real connection. Am I explaining that correctly?
I think you are right. I am trying very hard to minimize that power differential, yet still being aware no matter how much I try, it's still there. And I think trying to reduce it as well as recognizing that it's there is probably the key in interacting with patients and families. So there are little things that I, for example, do. Is I never introduce myself as Dr. Cohn when I meet somebody. I always say my name is Ronald Cohn.
And they know,
It's,
but they all know.
yeah, they do know, and but it's often like the first mini step towards reducing some of this power differential, right? But I think again, no matter how personal you try to be and how much you try to really establish a deep connection with your patients and families, which is something that I think every healthcare professional needs to do, it is important to recognize that the power differential is still there. These families, these children come to you because they have a problem and they're asking for your help. And I think there's nothing more important for us as healthcare professionals to understand and be very humble about the fact that we are being led into a circle of a family that is precipitated by a problem, usually like a medical problem. That is a huge privilege and a huge responsibility, and something that I think one can never minimize and for sure not forget.
And I think that's so important in any interaction, and like anybody coming into contact with anybody, um, whether it's me going to a grocery store and purchasing an item and the cashier is there, and I'm coming to her with a problem, I need to pay for my item, and or vice versa. It just seems just to be that humility that I'm hearing that is shining through on you, Dr. Khan, is admirable, and I think something that is so important for people to live with, and it's almost become the antithesis of a lot of the world that we live in today with the flashy Instagram posts and everything that we're trying to put out to the world. And
Yeah,
I think that's intimidating, and it pushes people away.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, you're up at this point and you come down to everyone else's level. Everyone's kind of like, what's going on here? Why is he down here? But I think the fact that you are still hands on with patients, you're still working in the lab, I feel like that gives it a whole different nature and different feel of who you are and what you're trying to get at in your position. So you're not trying to intimidate anybody. You're trying to work with them and get them to be what they want to be and get them where they want to go, kind of idea.
I think you're right. And it was interesting. I am doing this really because I need to do this for my own mental health view on self, because I would be missing it. But at the same time, I've also become to realize that it's actually really helpful for me to spend these 4 weeks throughout the year on the unit, directly on the unit, and see firsthand some of the problems that I sometimes just hear in discussions. And and that's something that I underestimated before I started this, how helpful it is to see those things and how helpful it is to actually work directly with some of our frontline healthcare workers.
Yeah, I think that's a very common. Well, it's not. I shouldn't say very common, but it is something a pretty regular business practice I hear goes on in Disney World. You'll have these major executives of the company working and selling popcorn for a week at a time. Um, I was listening. I was recently listening to a podcast of a four-star general who had been working in Afghanistan, and he described looking at a map and seeing like a unit, and just being able to move the unit. Is a little. It's represented by a little X, and he would just move the little X over, and sometimes he would lose sight of the fact that, like, no, I'm moving a X over, but what's it taking for that unit to move into enemy lines and across all that, and to really understand that, and him actually going and spending time with a unit really changed his whole perspective on how he was able to make those decisions, because it's not just an X. It was like, well, this is 100 150 people moving in a certain area, and what does that take? What is that, what's behind the scenes there? And I think it's that's very relevant for any leader to really get close when you're making those decisions, and not even necessarily a leader, anybody who's dealing with, and making decisions on a regular basis,
Yeah,
needs to really get close and understand.
yeah, I completely agree. Completely agree.
And made a whole show on it, an undercover boss. They went down and worked with the people and figured out what was going on. I mean, it's the fact that you're able to, and that, I mean, you have a lot to deal with as CEO and president, but then you're like, hey, I'm taking a break from that for a moment now. I'm going to go see some patients, do what I need to be doing to help people. I'm also going to spend time in the lab. I'd love to hear about this lab as well, the Con Lab. I would love to get into that idea of what you are working with in there and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so actually, for most of my research career, I have studied trying to understand why children with muscular dystrophy lose muscle mass and become weak, and trying to understand what I would call the pathogenesis of the disease. Why is this happening? And then about 8 years ago, when this new genome editing technology called CRISPR was first published in the concept of potential new therapeutic avenue for patients with genetic disorders, my entire laboratory changed focus. So our entire focus now is on trying to develop and design genome editing therapies for genetic disorders, whether that's muscular dystrophy or a few other neurogenetic disorders. That's really has become the focus of my research, together with my colleague, Dr. Ivakin, who was really the brain behind a lot of these ideas. And and that has been so far an unbelievably exciting time. I hope that before I retire, we can get at least one or two of those discoveries into the actual clinic to patients. That's obviously the ultimate goal. So we're working very hard on this.
So, within the confines of your research, and please, I am, I wouldn't say the young 18-year-old man who told a panel of doctors that I don't really like science. I do enjoy science, but I don't understand it. But I am curious, in your research, how much creativity would you say? Because when you think of research, you don't think of being creative. But it sounds, in order to be successful in research, you need a certain amount of creativity. How much creativity goes into uh, doing this kind of research, or coming up with these sort of tests or experiments that you're looking to understand or go in a certain direction with?
So I would argue that creative thinking is one of the key ingredients of every scientist. So when you look at an actual experiment, to conduct an actual experiment requires technical skill, a little bit of thought process, obviously organizational skill, but at the end of the day, you follow a certain protocol for whatever it is you do, and then you try to use these experiments to answer a question. But the creative thinking is an absolute key ingredient to come up with what's the question you want to ask and how do you think you can answer that question, thinking about what experiment should I be doing that is going to help me answer this question. And that is, I wouldn't say entirely, but to a large degree, dependent on whether you want to call it creative thinking, thinking outside the box. Because I think when you start doing experiments, you can get easily lost in trying to deal with technical problems, whether something works or it doesn't really work well enough. And sometimes you have to do that, but sometimes you need to also take a step back and think, okay, so I've been spending a lot of time trying to do this experiment. Is that actually the experiment that is going to help me answer this critical question? Or maybe there's something better to do. And all this then goes back to think outside the box, think creatively. And I think that's the key. That's what you learn when you are a scientist. Creative, critical thinking.
So, as somebody who's run a lab that has won, multiple awards, where does your creative thinking come from? How does that? Where do you? Is it just? And when you need to get creative, are there certain things that you'll do, or does it just hit you? Or I'm curious, where does that almost that artistic piece come from? Because when you think of a scientist, again, I don't think of a scientist as very artistic often, but it sounds like it's almost an integral part of any successful lab. So I'm curious, where does your creativity come from?
It's an interesting question. And if I think about it, I'm not sure that there's one answer I can give you. Because I think there are probably multiple ways of how you are creative. I mean, all of it starts with a certain amount of passion. You have to love what you do, and you have to be passionate about trying to, in this case, solve a problem. And then when you take that passion together with a certain amount of interest, and later on over time you develop certain skill of, I actually like to sit down and think about something creatively. Not everybody loves this necessarily, but if you love to think about a problem and try to love finding a solution for a problem, that together with passion is the way how I would probably answer your question. And that, by the way, is true for everything that I do. Like, I think whether that's for science or whether it's for my current role, I think if you are in a leadership role, no matter what kind of leadership role, you have to love problems because that's what you do very much throughout each and every hour of the day. You have to love it. And because if you don't love it, then I don't think you're going to be an effective leader. You can be like an operational leader, but true great leaders love, enjoy solving problems.
So, it's funny because we have a mutual friend, Israel Schachter,
Yeah,
and Israel introduced me, I would say maybe it was a year ago now, more than a year ago, to Wolfgang Puck, the famous chef.
yes,
And we actually the first time I met him in person, I met him at in one of his restaurants, and we sat down and we were having a drink and talking, and I said to him, I asked him a very similar question, like what would you say is one of the most important aspects of becoming a chef if somebody wants to go into that world. And he pointed to the maitre d' of his restaurant. And he said, "Do you see that man over there?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Right now he is the maitre d' of this restaurant. But in a couple years, he is going to be running all of my North American restaurant operations." And I said, "Really? How do you know that?" And he said one word: passion. This man is a passionate individual, and he's capable, but his passion for it is what shines through. And it's funny when you start to talk to people at this level, you start to see almost like all of the kind of the connections, and it's so interesting to me that passion is here and passion is there, and that's what brings it out, just perhaps in a different area because you chose to go into science and not become a maitre d' of a restaurant. But it's just so interesting to me.
I think just think about how hard people work, no matter what they do. Like a lot of people work so hard. If you're not passionate about what you do, then I don't think you can be successful. You can be fine at your job and you may enjoy it enough to keep going for 30 years. But if you really want to try to make a difference, and you want to try to accomplish something in your work, and I'm not talking about that everybody has to become a leader, don't get me wrong. But if you want to be really good at what you do, you have to love what you do. I mean, you get up every single day, go to work, and if work is nothing else but a means to pay your bills, then it's hard. And I think a lot of people may not have the passion for what they do, no matter what they like, independent of what they do. But I think the ones who are really good at what they do, they all love their job. Every single person will tell you, I'm passionate about what I do. And whether that's a person who's cleaning the floors, administrative assistant, or a chef in a restaurant.
It's pretty incredible, actually. Um, so I want to take us in a different area, if that's okay, Brian. Are we
Yeah,
okay?
absolutely.
So the last time, actually, I will say this. I think it's maybe 2018 or pretty close to the pandemic. You took the time to come to our offices here
Yeah,
on
I
Sci
remember.
Lifeline, and we are so appreciative of that you took the time to meet with us. And one of the things you talked about was the future of healthcare in Canada and Ontario, pediatric healthcare, and one of the things you said was you're looking to create a hospital without walls. Uh, you just perhaps I'm using the different terms that
No,
you actually use, but I think that was what. So I'm curious. That was a couple of years ago. Where are we at with that? And I'm sure the pandemic has put some damper on that, but I'm curious, in terms of the future of where pediatric healthcare is going and things of that nature. And if there's things you can't say now on a podcast, I understand that as well. But if you could share your vision or thoughts or ideas, I'm curious what our kids
100%.
have to look forward to.
well, I will say that in part the pandemic has facilitated that concept because we have implemented virtual care for patients within about 10 days. And which honestly, and it's probably somewhat embarrassing, but I think it would have taken us at least a year, if not 18 months, to implement something like this. So we were forced to implement virtual care because we needed to reduce the amount of people who come here. And so that was clearly one of the so-called silver linings of the pandemic. I think what we now need to do is to think about, so what are the other parts of this hospital without walls? And I will say this is only part of our overall precision child health strategy that really is thinking from a more global aspect about how we're going to try to move to a truly individualized healthcare concept for every patient and then their family, and try not to put people to try to fit people into a box of statistical numbers. And I give you one example of what we are already doing a little bit, but I think what needs to be scaled up is how can we monitor children who could potentially go home if we can monitor them. And there's a technical aspect to this. But then there's also another aspect to this with the program that we have started actually before the pandemic called Connected Care, which is a really wonderful innovation from our team here, where our nurses here at the hospital provide nursing support to nurses for children who are at home. Again, it's an opportunity to send children home a little bit earlier and or prevent children from coming to the hospital if not really necessary. And then the additional technical aspect to this is, and this is where we just still need to develop this, is how could we send a child home with a device or certain devices that could help us monitor the child in regard to some of the physiological measurements, giving us the confidence that you can actually be home, because if we think something is not right, we'll bring you back because we will get the data from your device telling us something may not be right. So I think that's kind of the next step, which I hope over the next year or so we can expand on. We do this already for some of our children with congenital heart disease, but there are many more opportunities. And at the end of the day, I would love to arrive at a place in a few years where we really only see children in this hospital who have to absolutely be here. And I think that's a journey which will take some time, because it's probably not as much dependent on the technology. The technology is here. It's dependent of us implementing it and us feeling comfortable. And when I say us, I mean patients, families, and the healthcare providers. We all have to become a team to feel comfortable with a different approach to how we're used to doing things for decades. So that's not going to be a process, but I think we'll get there. And when you look at the virtual care aspect, many families actually appreciated the fact that for a conversation that doesn't necessarily require us to physically put hands on a child, which sometimes is the case, sometimes you just discuss certain lab results and so on, it's wonderful for them to do this from home, not to drive here, not to wait, not to drive back through traffic. So I think the perception around having to always go to a hospital and see somebody in person has changed already. And we can leverage this in terms of knocking down some of these walls.
How foolproof is going virtual for physicians seeing patients? Like, for instance, if some, like obviously for coughs and colds and fevers, that kind of stuff, doesn't make sense to clog up an ER of a hospital. when you have more dire situations coming in. But for instance, if you have a child who's just constantly running high fevers, they get tests done, or the doctor sees them and says, yeah, it's probably just this, whatever it is. It gets kind of brushed under because they can't really see the patient, see what's going on. So it's kind of like what you mentioned, going into the unit, seeing really how things are working. It's kind of the same idea with a patient. You can't really see how things are working all the time if you can't see them in person. So is it foolproof like that, or is it there's still going to be situations where they are going to actually have to come in just because you can't, their doctor or physician isn't able to actually diagnose over the computer, over the phone?
So the full honest answer to this is we are learning as we go. And I think we are currently very, very much operating on the conservative side. And whenever we are not 100% comfortable giving advice, making a decision about something without seeing a child, we tell the parents to come. I think over time, it will be interesting to see how much we can further develop the virtual aspect of what can be done at home and what cannot be done at home. That's a learning process. And I think as long as we are open to this, even if we are operating on the more conservative side sometimes, it will be beneficial. I don't know what you mean by foolproof, but one thing is for sure, there are certain things that are excellent for virtual care. And like you said, there are certain things that cannot be done virtually and shouldn't be ever done virtually. But I can tell you from our own experience, the minority of the time when people use virtual services, whether that's in the emergency room or even when we do it throughout clinic, where we make a decision ahead of time whether we think it's appropriate or not, the minority of time we feel like, we should have seen somebody in person.
Yeah, I mean, I really like what you said, doctor, about, it's a team, and you included, the patient and the parents in that team. And I think so much of what needs to change is parents' perspective of being comfortable, because I know as a father of 4 children myself, like, I never want to be that person who's like, yeah, I didn't want to go to the emergency room and my kid, had a broken arm and they were complaining their arm was hurting them really bad and crying about it, and then and you only find out a day or two later when they bother you enough that, hey, we need to go. So
that was me.
So parents certainly, I never want to be accused of that. So I'm always going to err on the side of caution, and I'm going to try to go in. So I think changing that mindset of everybody, including the parents and the families, is going to be huge. But I want to ask, so where does that leave organizations like Chai Lifeline, organizations, and I don't want to name outside organizations, but the SickKids has relationships with, Camp Ooch and Make a Wish and Starlight and all these different organizations. And I'm curious, when you go virtual as a hospital, where do you see organizations like Chai Lifeline being involved or being a part of that?
So I don't want to limit my answer to just virtual care, but look at it a little bit broader. And what I mean with this is, if we think about who can and who should be part of the circle of care and who can help support the patient, whether that's in the hospital or outside the hospital, I think that the role of organizations like yours, like a volunteer organization, is actually going to be exponentially more important over the years to come. Look, we have a human resource shortage and a crisis that is global. That's not just at SickKids, that's not in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We have this globally. When I speak to my colleagues in Germany, in Israel, in England, we all have the same issues. All of a sudden, we don't have enough people working in the healthcare system. So until you find ways to attract people back into it, train a significant new number of people, creating a situation where the patients and the families are much, much more involved and part of the care, plus volunteer organizations, it's going to be a critical part to the solution. I think it may require some rethinking of how that's going to look like, as opposed to how it's going to look right now. But I actually believe that these kind of services are going to be a critical and fundamental way of how we're going to deal with the current healthcare crisis.
That's so interesting because when we talked a couple of years ago, you had said something similar, but I didn't even think about it in terms of the current healthcare staffing crisis that's going on.
I remember that I said something similar because I always believed in it, but I think it is becoming even more critical now than it has ever been. I think the kind of support that you provide through High Lifeline and thank God there are many different organizations for different children and so on who try to do something similar. It was a nice to have 3 years ago, and now I think it's almost a must have. No pressure on you, but
No, I mean, listen, I've believed this, the team here has believed this and known this for a long time. The support and the care, when you ask a family who's gone through, a crushing diagnosis, whatever that horrible diagnosis is, and had High Lifeline hold their hand the whole way through, versus a family who might have gone through a similar type of thing in similar circumstances and not had an organization like High Lifeline hold their hand the whole way through. I mean, the difference is massive, and it's very hard for us to be able to kind of measure that happiness scale versus non-happiness scale and things of that nature. But just the support and the ideas and things that we hear from our families colloquially, and understanding that, I would say, here at High Lifeline, we have 24 year-round programs that we provide. But our most important and our most integral is our case management program. And the case management program is really where we have a social worker or a therapist who works really closely with these families, and they have somebody basically holding their hand. They call, if they're in crisis, they're connecting with this person sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. And that to us is everything. And whatever happens to these children, whether things they heal or they don't heal, these relationships and connections last for years afterwards. And I have children that I've known and I knew when they were little kids, and now they're adults, and they will, at the drop of a hat, whatever they can do to help the organization, they will do. And it's just incredible to see, and it's really that relationship that is built of that hand holding. So
I find we even have current clients whose parents want to volunteer with us, and we got to be like, no, we're taking care of you. You can't be taking care of things we got to be taking care of. Go be with your kid or go be with your husband or wife. So it is such a crucial, integral part of what we do, and being able to hold the hands of our clients and just being in there and showing face and possibly giving toys, giving wow gifts that we do, that kind of stuff. It really does make the world a difference to these people and to the clients. And
it does. And like I said before, I think it's even much more important now and for the near-term future than it has ever been, honestly.
If you go virtual, what would that look like for the hospital itself? Like, would staffing change? Would it just be a lot less people coming in and out of it? Would things speed up, operations kind of speed up, openings happen more?
I would say almost all of well, I don't think it changes staffing significantly. It changes how staff are working. right? How are we preparing for virtual care visits? How are we conducting virtual care visits? That's something we are all learning this, right? Nobody taught you in medical school how do you actually conduct virtual care visits. Nobody knows this. No, in the entire world, nobody knows how to do this. We just we are just learning how to do this. And of course, it's creating an enormous amount of efficiencies.
Well, Doctor, I want to say we have come to the end of our time today. I have so many more questions I could ask you, and there's so much more to say. But we do really appreciate your time and appreciate that you gave your time to Chai Lifeline for this podcast. And like I said, I've known you for a number of years. It's been a real pleasure today. I thank you again, and Chai Lifeline certainly values our relationship with SickKids, and I hope in the long run we can work together for many, many years. So thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, and thank you for everything you're doing. It was fun talking to you.
Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Cohn, for your time today. We are greatly appreciative of your time, wisdom, and insight. You've had and continue to have a very difficult job navigating these times with COVID and what the future of healthcare will look like for us in Ontario. The incredible work and research you are doing in the Cohn Lab is remarkable and cutting edge, and we can't wait to see what breakthroughs you have. It's also amazing to hear that even though you are the CEO and you have so many duties to take care of, running a hospital, you make it a priority to see patients and be in your lab. And this is a great way to see what is working in the hospital, what isn't working in the hospital, what needs fixing, and what the issues that you are hearing about, how they are really affecting things going on in the hospital and on the floor. It also allows the medical staff that you work with to see you in a different light, that yes, you are the CEO, but at the same time, you're the same as them. You're a doctor, you want to help people. And it makes you more approachable towards your teams as well, and makes them easier for them to talk to you about the issues that are happening. So we wanted to wish you continued luck with the progress to returning to normalcy in the hospital. And the listeners, we want to thank you guys as well for taking the time to listen to our interview today with Dr. Cohn. There is a lot to take from this episode, but as always, there is growth, there is resilience, and there is always hope. On Air with Chai is a Chai Lifeline Canada project produced by myself, Bryan Strasberg, hosted by myself and the Chai Lifeline Canada Executive Director, Mordechai Rothman. Guests are booked by Orly Davis, and graphic design is done by Candice Alper. On Air with Chai is edited by myself, and the music is provided by Music Unlimited at pixabay.com. To learn more about Chai Lifeline and how you can help us, please visit our website at chailifelinecanada.org.